Mary hadn't stepped into this part of the house in years. The garage, once a space of order and purpose, now felt like a forgotten world of its own. Her late husband had always kept it neat, each tool in its place, every box labeled with care. But over time, the shelves filled, the corners disappeared, and now it was something else entirely. Stacks of boxes loomed high, some with writing so faded she could barely read it. Holiday decor 1997, kids' old clothes, tools, keep. She reached for one, her fingers tracing the dust, hesitating before peeling back the brittle tape. Inside, tangled Christmas lights, a worn-out angel figurine, a holiday card from someone whose handwriting she recognized but whose face she could no longer picture. She smiled for a moment, letting the warmth of old memories wash over her. But as she dug deeper, something unexpected surfaced, not just memories, but weight. Not the kind you can hold in your hands, but the kind that lingers in your chest. A quiet, unshakable weight. Was she keeping these things to honor the past, or were they keeping her from moving forward? It happens so easily. We tell ourselves we're saving memories, but over time, we realize we're carrying more than just things. We're carrying the past. But here's the truth. Decluttering isn't about losing. It's about making room for the life we're living now. So how do you know when it's time to let go? Today, we're uncovering 9 signs that your belongings may be weighing you down without you even realizing it. And as we go through them, I invite you to ask yourself, is this my story too? Because by the end of this, you won't just see your home differently, you may just feel a little lighter yourself. So take a breath, settle in, and let's begin. And if this message speaks to you, consider subscribing to Elderly Wisdom Story, where we honor the past, cherish the present, and create space for what truly matters. She stepped away from the garage that day, but something stayed with her, a heaviness she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the stacks of boxes gathering dust. It was something deeper, something that had settled in her home over the years without her noticing. As she walked into the living room, she let her eyes wander, really seeing the space for the first time in a long while. Every shelf, every tabletop, every corner held something, a porcelain figurine, a framed picture, a decorative plate passed down for generations. Beautiful, yes. Meaningful, certainly. But suddenly it felt overwhelming. When had her home stopped feeling like a place to live and started feeling like a place to store the past? It happens so easily. A vase from a trip years ago, a collection of souvenirs tucked into every corner, gifts too sentimental to part with. At first, they bring joy, each one a reminder of a person, a place, a moment. But over time, they multiply. Slowly, the warmth of a cozy home gives way to something else, spaces carefully arranged for display, as if life itself has taken a step back to make room for things. And without realizing it, we start moving around the objects rather than moving freely through our homes. We dust around them, organize them, rearrange them, never asking if we truly need them, only knowing that they are there, taking up space, demanding care, holding a presence. But a home isn't meant to be a museum of everything we've ever owned. It's meant to be a place where life happens. And life needs space. Space to breathe. Space to rest. Space to exist without the quiet burden of too much. The answer isn't in stripping everything away, but in choosing what truly matters. Keep the pieces that bring joy, the ones that make you pause and smile, and let the rest go. Instead of filling every surface, allow space for light, for air, for movement. And if letting go feels too hard, gather the most cherished small items and create a memory box, a private collection of the things that hold meaning without letting them take over your home. Because your home should be a reflection of the life you are living now, not just a storage space for the past. She had spent the morning moving through her home, noticing how every surface seemed to hold something from another time. But it wasn't just the shelves or the walls, there were things tucked away, hidden in places she hadn't thought about in years. She walked to the hallway dresser and pulled open a drawer, the wood creaking as if even it had grown tired of waiting. Inside, there they were, the things she had promised herself she'd use. A set of knitting needles from when she thought she'd take up a new hobby. Pasta maker still in its box. A pile of unopened stationery waiting for letters she had never written. She had always told herself she was being practical, that these were useful things, valuable things. Someday she had thought, I'll need this. But as she looked at them now, she realized that someday had been hanging over her for years and it never came. Instead, these objects sat untouched, collecting dust and expectation, filling not just her drawers but her mind with quiet reminders of things undone. And perhaps that was the real weight. Not the things themselves, but what they represented. The idea that letting go was wasteful. The belief that these things still had a purpose, even when they hadn't served one in years. But what if the real waste wasn't in getting rid of them, but in holding on to them? What if someday was keeping her from living fully today? She picked up the knitting needles, turning them over in her hands. Use it or let it go, she told herself. If it truly mattered, she would give it a place in her life now, not leave it buried in a drawer for another year. And if she let it go, someone else would use it. Someone else would give it the life she never did, because the things we keep for someday rarely serve us the way we think they will. And sometimes the greatest act of moving forward is simply making peace with what will never be. She had let go of a few things, small, forgotten objects that had sat untouched for years, but as she moved through the house, she realized that the weight of clutter wasn't just in the things she had tucked away. It was in everything. The shelves that needed dusting. The countertops that never stayed clear. The overflowing cabinets. The stacks of magazines that she meant to read but never did. She had spent years saving for retirement, imagining the peace of finally having time for herself. But instead of waking up to slow mornings filled with quiet joy, she woke up to messes waiting to be cleaned. It wasn't just the physical act of tidying that drained her, it was the endless cycle of it. No matter how much she put away, more seemed to take its place. She had traded the busyness of a career for the busyness of stuff. Her days were filled with reorganizing, shifting things from one place to another, searching for lost items buried under piles she had meant to sort through. And when she finally sat down to rest, there was always something in the back of her mind, a drawer that needed organizing, a box that should be sorted, a pile that was waiting for a decision she wasn't ready to make. Maybe the real solution wasn't in finding better ways to manage it all, but in finally deciding to have less to manage. She thought about how easily things entered her home. Another blouse, another kitchen gadget, another set of decorative trinkets. And yet, nothing ever seemed to leave. What if, from this moment forward, for every new item that came in, one had to go? A simple shift, but one that could change everything. And maybe instead of tidying room by room, she could look at things differently. What if she gathered every book in the house, every piece of clothing, every forgotten paper, and made choices with clarity, seeing everything at once instead of moving things from one place to another? Maybe then she wouldn't just be cleaning, she would be reclaiming. Reclaiming her time, her energy, her home. And maybe, just maybe, the life she had been waiting for had been there all along, hidden beneath the weight of too much. She had already begun to make space. The countertops were clearer, the shelves lighter, and yet, as she stepped into her bedroom and opened the closet doors, she felt it again, the quiet weight of too much. Hangers pressed together so tightly that pulling one free took effort. Dresses she hadn't worn in years. Blouses with tags still attached. A row of neatly pressed slacks from a time when her days required structure, now untouched and gathering dust. And yet, despite the choices before her, she reached for the same 3 or 4 outfits, the ones that felt most like her now. It wasn't just fabric she was holding onto. It was moments, identities, versions of herself that no longer fit quite right. The dress she wore to her daughter's wedding, the coat she bought for a trip she never took, the blouses from her working years, still waiting for a life she no longer lived. She told herself she kept them for practical reasons. What if I need this someday? But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't keeping clothes. She was keeping memories. And some part of her feared that letting go of the clothes meant letting go of the person she was when she wore them. She reached for a hanger and ran her fingers along the fabric, knowing something had to change. Maybe it was time to stop holding on to someday and start making room for today. She turned every hanger backward. If in 6 months it still hung untouched, she would let it go. And this time, she would set a new rule. Whatever remained had to fit in one section of the closet, no more. Because a closet should hold what serves you, not what burdens you. And maybe, just maybe, by letting go of the clothes that no longer fit her life, she would finally have space to embrace the life that did. She had already let go of clothes that no longer fit, made space for the life she was living now. But as she moved through the house, she realized there were things she had held onto for far longer than dresses or old jackets, things packed away in boxes, wrapped carefully in tissue, stacked neatly in closets and attics, waiting. For what, she wasn't sure. She pulled open a box marked family keepsakes, the writing faded, the edges soft with time. Inside, an old embroidered handkerchief, once her grandmother's, delicate as lace. Letters, their ink slightly smudged, carrying words written by hands that were now long gone. A bundle of postcards from places she had once wandered, places she thought she might return to but never did. She had saved these things because they mattered. And yet, here they were, tucked away, unseen, untouched. Had she really been preserving them, or had she simply been storing them, afraid that letting go would mean forgetting? She traced her fingers over the delicate stitching of the handkerchief, the paper-thin softness of a letter. These weren't just objects. They were moments, stories, people. But did they belong in a box, or did they deserve to be part of the life she was living now? She made a quiet decision. A single shelf, carefully chosen, would hold the pieces that truly spoke to her heart, not a cluttered collection, but a tribute to the moments worth remembering. A framed letter. A cherished photograph. A keepsake she could reach for, hold, remember. And then, something even more meaningful. She would not keep these stories to herself. One evening, she gathered her family, lifting each piece from the box, telling the stories behind them. She watched their faces light up with recognition, with laughter, with shared memories. And in that moment, she understood. Memories don't live in boxes. They live in the stories we pass down, the moments we relive together. She had already begun to let go, the clothes that no longer fit, the keepsakes that had been hidden away for years. But as she moved through her home, she found herself pausing in front of one particular cabinet. Inside were gifts she had received over the years, each one carefully placed, yet never truly used. A ceramic figurine from a friend. A scarf in a color she never wore. A delicate set of teacups that had remained untouched for years. These weren't just objects. They were reminders. Not of moments she had chosen, but of moments chosen for her. And as she ran her fingers over them, she felt something unexpected, not joy, not even nostalgia, but guilt. She wasn't keeping them because she loved them. She was keeping them because she felt she should. Because to let them go felt like letting go of the person who gave them. It felt ungrateful, almost cruel, as if removing them from her home erased the kindness behind them. She could picture the faces of those who had given them, the thought they had put into choosing them. And yet, wasn't the purpose of a gift to bring joy, not obligation? Wasn't the act of giving meant to be a moment of love, not a lifelong responsibility? She took a deep breath and decided to see them differently. Instead of guilt, she chose gratitude. She held each item for a moment, thanked it for the kindness it represented, and then let it go. Some she donated, imagining the happiness they might bring to someone else. Others she repurposed. The teacups that once sat unused now held fresh flowers on her kitchen table, turning an object of guilt into something that made her smile. And as she closed the now empty cabinet, she realized something. Letting go of the object didn't mean letting go of the love behind it. It simply meant making space for things that truly belonged. She had spent days letting go. The clothes that no longer fit, the gifts that carried more guilt than joy, the keepsakes hidden away in boxes. But as she moved through her home, she realized there was something else, something she had convinced herself didn't count as clutter. The storage bins. They lined the walls of the basement, stacked neatly in the attic, tucked away in closets. Dozens of them, carefully labeled, winter clothes, old photographs, holiday decor, miscellaneous keepsakes. Each one held something she wasn't ready to part with. Things that weren't useful but weren't quite ready to be let go. They had become a way to hold onto just in case. A way to avoid deciding. She had told herself she was staying organized, that everything had its place. But if that were true, why did she still feel like there was never enough space? Why did she keep buying more bins, shifting things around, making room for things she hadn't touched in years? It was then she realized she wasn't organizing. She was postponing. She wasn't making space. She was making it easier to hold onto things she no longer needed. She placed her hand on one of the bins and asked herself a simple question: if I didn't already own this, would I buy it today? The answer, more often than not, was no. And with that, something shifted. Instead of making space for more storage, she set a new rule: if it didn't fit in one designated area, it was time to reduce. She sorted, donated, and let go. And as the bins emptied, something else happened too. The weight lifted. Because a home should be a place for living, not a place for storage. She had already started letting go of the clothes that no longer fit, the storage bins filled with forgotten things, the gifts she had kept out of obligation rather than love. But as she moved through her home, she noticed there were still spaces she avoided, doors she had learned not to open. The spare room at the end of the hall. The attic stairs she never climbed. The basement she told herself she would sort through one day. Every time she walked past those spaces, she felt a quiet heaviness settle in her chest. Behind those doors wasn't just clutter, it was unfinished business. Piles of things she didn't know what to do with, boxes filled with memories, obligations, and decisions postponed for years. It wasn't just about the mess itself, it was the mental weight of knowing it was there, waiting. She had convinced herself that closing the door made it easier. But the truth was, the avoidance was its own burden. A quiet guilt that lingered at the back of her mind. A reminder, every time she passed by, that this was another thing left undone. And wasn't her home supposed to be a place of peace? Not a place filled with closed doors and quiet dread? So she stopped waiting for the right time. Instead of looking at the whole space, she started with just 10 minutes. That was all. One box, one shelf, one small piece of the overwhelm. And when she finished, she did something different. She took a picture. Not of what still needed to be done, but of what she had already done. Day by day, the room felt less like a burden and more like a space she could reclaim. And as the weight lifted, she realized something: progress wasn't about perfection. It was about finally choosing to begin. She had started small, one drawer, one shelf, one room at a time. She had let go of things she no longer needed, faced the memories she had stored away, and opened doors she had once kept shut. But as she moved through her home, she realized something. There was still one thing left to declutter: the habit of waiting. For years, she had told herself she would get to it someday. She would sort through the attic next spring. She would clean out the garage when she had more time. She would tackle the papers, the closets, the storage bins, just not today. But someday had stretched into years, and the things she once planned to deal with had only grown. The hardest part wasn't letting go. It was starting. She wasn't just avoiding the clutter, she was avoiding what it represented. Some things carried memories she wasn't ready to face, others reminded her of plans that had quietly slipped away. Decluttering wasn't just about organizing, it was about confronting the past and deciding what still belonged in her present. So she made a promise to stop waiting for the perfect time and start with just 10 minutes. No overthinking, no big commitments, just one small action. She turned on her favorite music, let the familiar rhythm soothe her hesitation, and before she knew it, she had done more than she planned. Someday wasn't coming. It had to be today. And as she stood in her newly cleared space, she felt something unexpected: lightness. Not just in her home, but in her heart. She stood in the center of her home, but for the first time in years, it felt different. The weight was gone. The quiet guilt of closed doors, the endless task of organizing, the stacks of things she once thought she needed, they had all been replaced by something else. Space. Light. Ease. She ran her fingers along an empty countertop, noticing how peaceful it felt without clutter pressing in from every direction. The air itself seemed lighter, as if the home had exhaled after years of holding its breath. But the greatest change wasn't in her home, it was in her heart. She had spent so much of life holding on to things, believing they were what kept the past alive. But she realized now the past wasn't in the things. It was in her. In the love she had shared, the lessons she had learned, the stories she carried. Letting go hadn't erased anything. It had simply made space for the life she was still living. And isn't that what we all deserve? A home that serves us, not one we serve. A space that brings peace, not obligation. A life where we are surrounded by what truly matters, not what weighs us down. It all starts with one step, one drawer, one shelf, One decision to stop waiting for someday and start living today. So what about you? Which sign resonated with you the most? What small step can you take today? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your journey. And if this message spoke to you, consider subscribing to Elderly Wisdom Story, where we embrace the past, cherish the present, and make space for the life ahead. Let's take this journey together.